Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how to place actors into the world and manipulate them around. This is going to involve the manipulation of actors by the way of translation, rotation, and scale. And we'll go over the main ways that developers manipulate objects in their level to get it looking just right. This allows us to customize our level to make it exactly how we want it for our shooter game. So let's get started. So here's my FPS level. This is the duplicate of the demo scene from the modular building set. Now, as you can see, this level contains a very large number of individual objects, and these all come together to form the level. So we're going to go over the various ways to manipulate these objects. Now, we can select any object in the world by simply left-clicking on it. And you can see that once I've selected this floor, that it's outlined in yellow. And in the world outliner, it's showing me the objects I have selected. And as you can see, I have multiple objects selected. That's because this floor is a collection of multiple objects, and they've been grouped together. Now, we'll talk about grouping and ungrouping objects shortly. Now, in addition to simply left-clicking on an object in the world to select it, we can also select objects directly in the world outliner. For example, if I select an object here, I now have it selected in the world somewhere. And if I look around, I could probably find the little gizmo that shows where I have an object selected. But if I can't find it, I can always focus on it by hitting the F key. And I'll zoom in on that object that I have selected. Now I'm holding Alt and left clicking to rotate around the object I have selected. And holding Alt and right clicking, I can zoom in and out closer or away from that object. Now I can find where this object exists in my folder structure in the content browser by browsing to it, as we've seen. If I right-click on the object in the viewport, I can select Browse to Asset. And we've seen that I can right-click on the object in the World Outliner and browse to it from there. So this particular static mesh actor exists in this folder here. Now let's say I want another one of these objects in the world. So I'm going to maneuver my way down to the floor so I can bring one in. Now, bringing in a static mesh is as easy as clicking on it from the content browser and dragging it onto the viewport. Now, before I release my left mouse button, notice that I'm placing it onto the floor, and it's sort of snapping down to the ground. If I release, now my object is here in the world on the ground. Now, let's talk about this little gizmo that has 3 arrows, a red, green, and blue arrow. These arrows represent directions in the world. And if you look to the lower left corner of the viewport, we have a little miniature version of this. And it's showing me world directions. The world has its own z-axis, pointed straight up, and it has its own x and y axes. You can think of these as sort of north and west, and the gizmo on the object I have selected corresponds to those directions. I can move the object in a single direction, such as the x direction, by clicking on the red arrow and dragging, and I'm moving the object back and forth in the x-axis. I can click and drag the green arrow to move back and forth in the y-axis, and of course I can click the blue arrow to bring the object up and down. Now if I look at the object from the side, I'll see that this gizmo exists in the center of the mesh. That's the mesh's origin, also known as its pivot point. Now, when we dragged in the object, it snapped to the ground according to its pivot point. That means if I look closely, I can see that the object is halfway into the ground because its origin is what snapped to the ground. Now, let's say I don't want the object overlapping with the ground. I can drag it up above the ground and hit the End key, that's E-N-D, on my keyboard. And that will snap it to the ground according to the lower surface of the geometry. So if you have the End key on your keyboard, you can snap objects to the ground in this way, and they'll snap according to the bottom of the mesh rather than the actual pivot point, which may or may not be on the bottom of the mesh. That depends on where the artist who created this mesh placed that pivot point in relation to the mesh geometry. Now we've seen that we can move objects in a particular axis. But notice that the gizmo has these little boxes that connect each pair of axes. If I hover over this little box between the Z and X axes, I see that both of those axes are highlighted, and I can click and drag and I'm moving the mesh in both the Z and X directions simultaneously. In other words, I'm moving the mesh in the ZX plane. This can be useful if you'd like to move an object in two of the corresponding world directions at the same time, but not move it in that third direction. For example, if I select the Y and X axes together, I can drag the object around on the ground, but its Z location is not changing. And you can see that in the Details panel for this mesh under Transform. We have Location, Rotation, and Scale. And as I move the object around, its X and Y locations are changing. So this is how we can translate objects or move them in the world. Now at the top of the viewport, we have various icons. This icon shows that I'm translating objects, and right next to it, we have another icon that allows us to rotate objects. If I select this icon, notice that the gizmo changes. It has 3 colored arcs, a green, a red, and a blue. By clicking on the blue arc, I can rotate the object about the Z-axis. Clicking the red arc rotates the object about the X-axis, and clicking the green arc rotates the object about the Y-axis. Now, next to the rotation icon, there's another one, and clicking this icon gives me a different gizmo. It's similar to the translation gizmo, except instead of arrows, we have boxes at the end of each corresponding axis on the gizmo. These are for scaling the object. Now, I can scale it in the Y direction by selecting the green box and stretching the object in the Y direction. I can stretch it in the X or in the Z directions. And you can see that the lines connecting each pair of axes allows me to stretch the object in 2 axes at the same time. I can highlight the green and red and stretch the object in the XY plane. Now let's go back to translation mode. And I want you to notice that as I move the object left and right, it's snapping by discrete increments. That's because snapping is enabled for translation. This icon here shows me that I have snapping enabled. And if I click it, it's no longer blue. And now I can drag the object smoothly. It's no longer snapping by increments. Now the number next to that icon tells me that when snapping is enabled, I'm snapping by increments of 10 units. In Unreal Engine, 1 unit corresponds to a centimeter by default. I can increase the snapping increments by clicking that 10 and choosing a new snap size. If I select 50, now I will snap the object by increments of 50 units. Snapping can be enabled or disabled for rotation as well. That's this angle icon here. Let's go back to rotation mode. I can click this icon to do that, or I can use the hotkey, which is the E key. The hotkey for translation mode is the W key, so hitting W brings me back to translation, and hitting E brings me back to rotation. Now, I'm snapping by 10-degree increments as indicated by this 10 here, and I can choose a new rotational snap size, such as 30 degrees. Now I'm rotating by 30 degrees for each snap increment. Let's go back to scale mode, and the hotkey for that is R, and I see that snapping is enabled for scaling as well. So I'm scaling by increments of 0.25. That's 0.25 of the overall size of the object. And I can change snapping increments for scaling as well. So I can increase the scale snap to a higher value if I'd like to scale by larger increments. Now let's say I've scaled this object to how I want it, and I'd like to duplicate it. I'm going to hit the W key to go back to translation mode. And to duplicate this object, I simply need to hold the Alt key on the keyboard and left-click on one of the handles on the gizmo and drag. And now I have a duplicate of the object I had selected. We can duplicate multiple objects at the same time. If I want to duplicate both of these at the same time, I can select them both. With one object selected, I can hold Shift and left-click on the other object, and now I have them both selected. As you can see by the yellow outlines, and in the World Outliner, I see that I have 2 objects selected. I can hold Alt and click and drag one of the handles to create a duplicate of both of them. Now, as I'm dragging objects around by left-clicking a handle on the translation gizmo, if I hold the Shift key and drag, the camera will follow the objects that I'm dragging. Now, duplication works with translation as well as rotation. If I have one of these objects selected and I hit the E key to enter rotation mode, I can hold Alt and rotate the object, and I'll create a duplicate this way. So now I have a duplicate in the same location, only the rotation is different. Now notice this flickering here. This is called Z fighting. That's because I have two objects, and part of the objects are overlapping and occupying the same space. So the engine doesn't know which surface to show where the objects are overlapping. So it's flickering between showing one of the object's surfaces and showing the other. Z fighting can be fixed by simply not having two objects' faces occupying the same space. So I can hit W and drag one of these objects away, and now I have no Z fighting. Now let's talk about grouping. Multiple objects can be grouped together. All I need to do is select multiple objects, so I'll select this one, hold Shift and left click to select this one, and now I have them both selected. I can right click on my selection and choose Group, and we see that Ctrl-G is the keyboard shortcut to do this. When I select Group, I now have a group of two static mesh actors, and when I move them as a group. I can select another object, and then come back to my group and click on one of them, and I'll see that I've selected the entire group. Here in the World Outliner, I see that both static meshes are selected, along with something else called a group actor. The group actor was created the moment I grouped them together. This can make it handy for keeping objects together. Now let's say I'd like to ungroup these objects. To do that, I can right-click on the group and go to Groups and select Ungroup. And of course, Shift-G is the keyboard shortcut for this. If I ungroup, then that group actor that was created for this particular group is now gone, and I can now select each object individually and move it around like so. Now, if I don't want to snap these objects by increments, I can disable snapping and move them smoothly. In level creation, this is typically done to place objects exactly how we want them in the world. I'm going to go ahead and select each of these and hit the Delete key to delete them from the world. So for your challenge for this video, I'd like you to add some static mesh actors to the level. Place some static meshes in the world and customize the level a bit. You can translate, rotate, and scale objects, and if you're feeling ambitious, you can go ahead and group several objects together and duplicate or manipulate those objects as you like. Pause the video and customize your level just a little bit now. Alright, so I'd like to customize my level just a bit. Now we're going to be doing this more throughout this course, so there's no need to go crazy at this point. I'm just going to create a duplicate of this post here. Now as I select it, I see that it's made of multiple objects, and they're not grouped together, so I'm going to select the beam and hold Shift to select this top part here, and keep Shift held down to select the sign. And I see that these three static meshes make up this whole sign. Now to make this easier on myself, I'm going to right-click and group these together, and now I have a group of static mesh actors, and I can hold Alt and click and drag to bring out a copy of this sign. So I'd like 2 or 3 extra signs, so I'm going to create several copies. I'm going to hold the Shift key down as I'm duplicating this one so I can bring the camera along with me as I'm moving the object. So in this lecture, we talked about actor manipulation, and we learned how we can translate, rotate, and scale objects in our world. We talked about grouping and how we could duplicate by holding the Alt key and translating or rotating individual objects or groups of objects. We discussed snapping and how we can change the snap amount when manipulating objects, and how snapping can be enabled or disabled. We'll continue with object manipulation in the videos to come as we customize our level even more. Great job! I'll see you soon.